At my sister's promotion ceremony, my father raised a glass in front of a 4-star general and declared, "Genevieve is the future of American strategy." Then he turned to me, his voice dropping. "Kaylin, on the other hand, she's just a supply clerk, a throwaway." Laughter rippled through the room, but they didn't know that this throwaway would soon own the very legacy they were standing on. My name is Kaylin Vance. I'm 31 years old, and on that crystalline evening in Washington, D.C., I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I was standing in the cavernous main hall of the Officers Club at Fort McNair, a place so steeped in tradition you could practically smell it on the air. A heavy mix of lemon-scented floor polish, old money, and the unyielding pride of the U.S. Army. The gleaming oak floors reflected the light from towering crystal chandeliers, splintering it into a million dazzling pieces. The room was a sea of deep blue Army service uniforms, the chests of high-ranking officers glittering with rows of medals that told stories of service and valor. And then there was me. I wore a simple navy blue cocktail dress, a deliberate island of civilian anonymity in an ocean of military prestige. I felt utterly and completely out of place. My mother, Dr. Isolde Thorne, a woman whose scalpel was warmer than her smile, glided past me with a curt, clinical nod. Her attention was already captured by the wife of a general, her hand extended in a gesture of practiced charm. Across the room, my sister, Genevieve, was the radiant sun around which this entire universe revolved. Freshly promoted to the rank of major, her smile was a brilliant, perfectly rehearsed masterpiece. She was the center of it all. I was a shadow, a name on a list, an uninvited guest at my own family's celebration. I clutched my glass of water like an anchor in a storm, retreating to a corner where the wallpaper was more interesting than the conversations I wasn't a part of. Then my father, Dr. Alistair Thorne, stepped up to the podium. His voice, lectern-perfect and resonant, filled the hall. He spoke not like a father, but like he was delivering a keynote address at the Strategic Studies Institute. He lauded Genevieve as the very embodiment of the Thorne legacy, praising her as a strategic mind that will shape 21st century defense policy. The words were polished, powerful, and entirely devoid of genuine warmth. As the polite applause subsided, General Miller, an old family friend with 4 silver stars gleaming on his shoulder, turned to my father. "A brilliant girl, Alistair, truly," he said with a warm chuckle. "But what about your other girl? I heard she was a Marine." A collective, curious gaze shifted in my direction. For a moment, the room held its breath. My father smiled, but the expression was a cold, barren thing that never reached his eyes. His gaze found me in my corner, pinning me to the wall like a specimen. Kaylin," he said, his voice carrying with effortless authority, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear clearly. He paused, as if searching for the right diplomatic words. "She's very good at making sure the boxes get where they need to go, on time." He let the dismissive words hang in the air for a beat, before delivering the final killing blow. "She's a supply clerk, a throwaway." The word throwaway didn't land with a crash. It landed with a sickening, profound silence that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. It was a silence punctuated by a few polite coughs, a ripple of awkward, half-formed laughter from someone who didn't know better, and the collective flicker of dozens of eyes turning away from me, suddenly finding their shoes or the ceiling intensely fascinating. No one spoke up. No one met my gaze. In that one gut-wrenching second, I glanced at my mother. I saw a flicker of irritation, cross her perfectly composed features. But it wasn't for me. It wasn't for the daughter who had just been publicly gutted by her own father. It was for the husband who had shown a lapse in protocol, who had displayed such a lack of social finesse in front of such important people. That's when the last fragile piece of hope I didn't even know I was holding finally shattered. I understood. It wasn't just that they looked down on me. I was an inconvenience to their perfect narrative, a smudge on their pristine family portrait. I didn't cry. Tears were a luxury I hadn't been afforded in years, a currency I had learned was worthless in their world. My spine, trained by the discipline of the Marine Corps, went rigid. My breathing remained even. My hand, which held my glass, did not tremble. With a slow, deliberate motion, I placed the glass of water down on a nearby table. The sound was a soft, definitive click against the polished wood. Then I turned my back on the hushed whispers and the polite, stifling air of the party. I walked, head held high, toward the massive carved oak doors. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I simply walked out, leaving behind the sound of their muted laughter, their glittering uniforms, and the entire hollow life I once thought was mine. The cold night air hit me, a welcome shock. In the quiet of my own mind, I saw a single clear image, a champagne flute, not shattering with a loud crash, but simply cracking from an internal pressure, then silently disintegrating into 1,000 pieces of fine, glittering dust. The engine of my old pickup truck hummed a low, steady rhythm as I drove away from Fort McNair, a familiar vibration that did little to soothe the tremor deep inside me. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I crossed the Arlington Memorial Bridge, the Lincoln Memorial a stoic, illuminated beacon in my rearview mirror, its light shimmering across the dark, cold surface of the Potomac River. The bridge is meant to symbolize reconciliation and reunification, a beautiful lie stretching over troubled waters. For me, it was just the road home, a road I knew by heart, a path that led straight back to the source of the wound. The word my father used, throwaway, wasn't a new weapon. It was just the first time he'd fired it in public. The memories began to surface, unbidden, as I drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Arlington. They weren't warm, comforting flashes of nostalgia. They were a map etched onto my soul, a detailed topography of every slight, every dismissal, every invisible scar that had led me to that moment in the officers' club. My destination appeared through the windshield, the stately 2-story red brick colonial house where I grew up. It stood perfect and imposing, the lawn manicured, the windows dark and blank. From the outside, it was the picture of American success. Inside, it had always been as clean, sterile, and cold as a museum gallery, a place for showcasing success, not for living. The ghosts of 1,000 dinners haunted its dining room. I could see it all with perfect, painful clarity. The heavy mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, my father at the head, holding court. He would engage Genevieve in complex discussions about military doctrine, about Clausewitz and the future of asymmetric warfare. She would parry his points with the sharp intellect that would one day carry her to West Point, and I, sitting on the other side, would try to join in. I remember one evening, my sophomore year, bubbling with excitement over a robotics project I was leading. I had designed a small all-terrain drone for a school competition. I managed to increase the battery efficiency by 12%, Dad, I'd said, my voice full of pride. He had looked up from his plate, offering me a brief, distracted smile. He reached across the table and gave my shoulder a perfunctory pat. "That's interesting, sweetheart. Very clever," he'd said, his eyes already flicking back to my sister. "Now, Genevieve, tell me about that essay you're writing on post-war reconstruction strategies." And just like that, my small, tangible achievement dissolved into the air. Unimportant, unheard. The favoritism wasn't just in his words, it was woven into the very fabric of our lives. When Genevieve received her acceptance letter to West Point, it was as if she had single-handedly won a war. My parents threw a massive party. Hundreds of guests milled through our cold, perfect house, champagne flutes in hand, celebrating the continuation of the Thorne legacy. It was a strategic event, a networking opportunity disguised as a family celebration. A year later, my own letter arrived. It was from the United States Marine Corps. I hadn't told them I was enlisting, I knew better. I left the envelope on my father's desk in his study. That evening, he summoned me. The letter was on the heavy blotter, looking small and insignificant. He didn't yell. Yelling was too common, too unrefined. He just looked at me with a profound, bone-deep disappointment. "You've disgraced this family, Kaylin," he said, his voice a low, controlled hum of fury. He couldn't understand, or perhaps he refused to, that I was also choosing a path of service. I was inspired by a history teacher, Mr. Abernathy, who once told our class, "History isn't just written by the generals, Kaylin. It's carried on the backs of the logisticians, who make sure the army can march." I wanted to be one of those people. My path didn't come with the polished prestige of West Point or a future in the Pentagon. It was a path of grit and grease, of ensuring the vast, complex machine of war had what it needed to function. To them, if it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't valuable. My choice wasn't a career, it was a betrayal of their brand. But the deepest cut, the one that truly defined my place in their world, came on my 16th birthday. It was supposed to be my day. I had looked forward to it for weeks, imagining a simple dinner, maybe a chocolate cake from the local bakery, the stuff of normal life. But on that same evening, a prominent U.S. senator had an unexpected opening in his schedule and invited my parents to a fundraising dinner. There was no hesitation on their part. My quiet birthday was instantly canceled, deemed expendable. I didn't understand the politics, only the ache in my chest. I cried hot, messy, teenage tears in the kitchen. My mother, Dr. Isolde Thorne, found me there. She didn't embrace me. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She looked at me with the cool, detached gaze of a surgeon assessing a minor, inconvenient complication. "Kaylin, grow up," she said, her voice sharp and sterile. What is one birthday party compared to a relationship that could help Genevieve secure a prime position after graduation? Don't be selfish. Don't be selfish. The word sliced through my grief and hit something fundamental. My future didn't matter. My feelings didn't matter. My simple wish for a birthday cake was selfish when weighed against the strategic advancement of my sister, the golden child, the one who reflected their ambitions back at them. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment so clear, so cold, that it redefines everything you thought you knew about your own family? That night, alone in my room, I finally understood. I wasn't a member of the family. I was an asset in the Thorne family portfolio, and I was an unprofitable investment. The love I thought was a birthright was in fact conditional, and I had failed to meet the conditions. The humiliation at Fort McNair wasn't the wound, it was just the salt being publicly, brutally ground into it. The moment I stepped off the bus, the air of Paris Island, South Carolina, hit me like a physical wall. It was a suffocating blanket of heat and humidity, thick with the smell of salt marsh and sweat. The soundtrack of my new life was the unending scream of the drill instructors and the percussive, rhythmic stomp of combat boots on hot asphalt. This was the forge. Here, no one cared that I was a thorn from Arlington, Virginia. My last name was worthless, my background irrelevant. They cared about one thing and one thing only. Could I perform? Could I run 3 miles without stopping? Could I hit a target at 500 yards? Could I endure the endless barrage of physical and mental stress without breaking? For the first time in my life, I was measured solely by my own merit. The legacy of the Thorne family was stripped from me, along with my civilian clothes and my long hair, which fell to the floor in a forgotten pile. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. I ran until my lungs burned, did push-ups until my arms gave out, and learned to field strip a rifle in the dark until my fingers were raw. But the physical agony was a clean, honest pain. It was infinitely more bearable than the slow, corrosive acid of 17 years of emotional neglect. In the cold, sterile house in Arlington, I had been invisible. Here, in the mud and the grime of the crucible, I was seen. I wasn't falling apart. I was being broken down and forged into something new, something stronger. I didn't just survive, I rose. My true test, however, wasn't on the manicured grounds of a training base. It was in the dust-choked reality of Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Helmand wasn't a strategic discussion over a dinner table. It was a tangible, living thing that wanted you dead. It was the fine, talcum-like dust that coated everything, the searing, relentless sun, and the constant, low-grade fear that hummed beneath the surface of every moment. As a logistics non-commissioned officer, my job was the unglamorous, life-or-death business of supply. I didn't plan raids or lead patrols. I made sure the Marines who did had the water, the ammunition, and the blood bags they needed to stay alive. My world was convoy schedules, threat assessments, and cargo manifests. I had to get my trucks from our main base to the forward operating bases, the FOBs, often under the cover of darkness, when the risk from improvised explosive devices, IEDs, was at its absolute peak. I learned to read the subtle language of the landscape, to calculate travel times down to the minute, to trust my gut. My decisions had immediate, irreversible consequences. One sweltering afternoon, a convoy was scheduled to depart for a remote outpost, Fob Gannon. The intelligence report showed the usual route as clear, but something felt wrong. A knot of pure instinct tightened in my stomach. I spent an hour poring over topographical maps, identifying an older, less traveled dirt track that would add 40 minutes to the drive. My commanding officer was hesitant, but I was insistent. I staked my reputation on it. He reluctantly gave the order to change the route. The next day, we got the report. A massive IED had been discovered and disarmed on the main route, exactly where our convoy would have been at the time of my original departure schedule. There was no medal for my decision, no public commendation. There was only the quiet, unspoken gratitude in the eyes of the young Marines whose lives I had saved. And for me, that was more valuable than any award my father could have mounted on his wall. During my entire 1-year deployment, I received a single email from my family. It wasn't from my mother or father, it was from Genevieve. The message contained no questions about my health, no words of concern for my safety. It was a simple, transactional request. "Kaylin," it read, "Dad wants a unique gift for a certain senator. Can you get a U.S. flag that has flown over a fob in Helmand and send it home? It would make for a great story at his next fundraiser. I stared at the screen of the ruggedized laptop, the distant rhythmic thud of outgoing mortar fire punctuating the silence of the tent. A great story. That's all my war was to them. A prop. A piece of set dressing for their grand theater of influence and power in Washington. My reality of dust, sweat, and fear was just a fascinating anecdote to be traded for political capital. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a profound, chilling emptiness. I hit the delete key, erasing her words from my screen, and with them the last lingering embers of any obligation I felt toward the Thorne family. I never replied. After my honorable discharge, I didn't point my truck south on I-95 toward the manicured lawns of Arlington. I drove north toward the grit and steel of Baltimore. It was a conscious choice, a rejection of the polished world that had rejected me. The city felt honest in its toughness, a place where you were judged by what you could do, not who you were. In a sprawling, forgotten industrial park, smelling of rust and damp concrete, I found my sanctuary, a dusty, cavernous garage. With a can of white spray paint, I stenciled Aegis headquarters on the roll-up door. It was a small act of defiance, a flag planted in a new world that was entirely my own. This was where Aegis Command was born. It wasn't just lines of code. It was a philosophy forged in the crucible of war. It was every hard-won lesson from Helmand, every near miss on a darkened road, every logistical nightmare I had untangled, all meticulously translated into a smart, secure, and intuitive system. My guiding light was a dog-eared copy of A Higher Standard, the memoir of General Anne E. Dunwoody, the Army's first female four-star general and a fellow logistician. Her words, "Logistics is not an afterthought. It is the lifeblood of the force," became my gospel. My life shrank to the four walls of that garage. I existed in a simple monastic loop, fueled by my meager savings. My diet consisted of instant ramen noodles, the salty broth a poor substitute for a real meal, and cheap, bitter coffee, brewed in a stained pot that was my most faithful companion. The space was cold, vast, and achingly lonely. The only sounds were the relentless click of my keyboard and the distant, melancholic rumble of freight trains passing in the night. Yet, amidst the solitude, a fierce sense of purpose took root. For the first time, I was building, not just surviving. I sent out hundreds of cold emails, my carefully crafted proposals, launched like messages in a bottle into the vast, indifferent ocean of the defense industry. The silence that came back was a familiar, heavy blanket, an echo of the Thorne family dinner table. Then, one gray Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar Ohio area code. A small, hungry logistics firm wanted a demo. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, flickered to life in my chest. I didn't hesitate. I threw my laptop in a bag, grabbed a handful of protein bars, and drove all night. My old pickup ate up the miles on the Pennsylvania and Ohio turnpikes, the hypnotic rhythm of the road a welcome distraction. I arrived in a nondescript office park just as the sun was casting a weak, watery light over the horizon. I delivered my presentation in a sterile conference room to a handful of impassive executives in ill-fitting suits. But my attention was drawn to one man in the back of the room. He didn't fidget or check his phone. He just watched me with an unnerving, focused intensity. He had the lean, powerful build of an athlete, coiled energy even in stillness, and a pair of sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through my corporate pitch to the woman who'd built it. A thin white scar cutting through his left eyebrow gave his face a rugged, serious quality. When I finished, The room offered a smattering of polite, non-committal applause. But he didn't clap. He simply stood up and walked toward me with a confident, purposeful stride. He extended a hand, his grip firm and sure. "Sergeant Vance?" he asked, his voice low and direct. It wasn't a question. "I'm Jax Riker, MARSOC. You coordinated an emergency resupply for us in the Korengal Valley, 2012. Your call saved 2 of my guys." The air left my lungs. The sterile conference room, the board executives, the hum of the fluorescent lights, it all faded away. He didn't see a throwaway. He didn't see the Thorne family's black sheep. He saw Sergeant Vance. He remembered a single critical decision I had made years ago, on the other side of the world, a decision that had mattered. He turned to the company's manager, his voice ringing with an authority that instantly commanded the room. "This system isn't theory," Jax said, gesturing toward my presentation screen. "It's built from blood and mud. We need to test it." That night, Jax and I sat in a dimly lit local bar, the kind with worn wooden tables carved with decades of initials and the comfortable smell of stale beer and fried food. We ordered a couple of cold domestic lagers, the condensation beating on the cheap, thick glasses. For the first time, I told my story, all of it, to someone who actually listened. He didn't offer pity or platitudes. He listened with the quiet, profound understanding of a man who had also seen the unvarnished reality of the world. When I finished, he just nodded slowly, taking a long drink from his bottle. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "Your family doesn't get it," he said, his voice rough with a sincerity that resonated deep in my bones. "They talk about strategy from their ivory towers, but they have no idea that no strategy on Earth works if the guy on the front line is out of ammo and water. You're not a throwaway, Kaylin." He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "You're the lifeblood." A warmth spread through my chest, a feeling so foreign and so powerful I almost didn't recognize it. It was more than just validation. It was the feeling of being truly seen. In a noisy bar in the middle of Ohio, with a man who was, until a few hours ago, a complete stranger, I had finally found a glimmer of what family was supposed to feel like. The warmth I'd found in that Ohio bar with Jax felt like a distant dream. Reality came crashing back a few weeks later in the form of a phone call. The caller ID displayed a number I hadn't seen in over a year. Alistair Thorne, my father. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I let it ring 4 times, my thumb hovering over the decline button, before a lifetime of conditioning made me answer. "Kaylin." His voice was the same as always, booming, authoritative, and completely devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I saw a mention of your little company in an industry newsletter. Well done. You've finally learned how to generate value." I remained silent, gripping the phone so tightly, my knuckles ached. The compliment wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment, a valuation. He was establishing a baseline before making a withdrawal. The silence stretched, and I refused to fill it. He finally continued, a slight edge of impatience in his tone. "Now is the time to fulfill your duty to this family. I need you to arrange a meeting for Genevieve with the senior leadership at DARPA. You're operating in that world now, Kaylin. It's time to leverage it. Don't let the efforts of this entire family go to waste because of your selfishness." He wasn't asking. He was issuing a command. The old familiar feeling of being a tool, a means to an end, washed over me. The hope that my success, built on my own terms, might finally earn me a sliver of genuine respect, evaporated. They hadn't changed. They had just seen that the throwaway now had a use. A basic tenet of military training echoed in my mind. Never let the enemy dictate your position. I would not let him drag me back onto his emotional battlefield. My little company was built on merit, not connections, I said, my voice steady and cold. I'm not in a position to arrange that kind of meeting. Make yourself in a position, he snapped, his true colors showing. That's an order. He hung up before I could reply. A few days later, my mother tried a different tactic. Her voice, when she called, was syrupy sweet, a tone she reserved for manipulating hospital administrators or the spouses of powerful men. "Kaylin, darling," she cooed, "I heard you had a little chat with your father. You know how he is, always so direct. But honey, you have to understand. We're a family. We support each other." I could hear the unspoken words hanging in the air. We support the one that matters. Genevieve is at such a crucial stage in her career, my mother continued, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. You wouldn't want to be the one to stand in her way, would you? Think of the family's image. What will people think if they see we aren't united? She never once asked how I was. She never mentioned Aegis Command beyond its utility. It was all about Genevieve's career, the family's image, what other people would think. I was just a cog in their public relations machine. I took a deep, steadying breath, the image of Jax's earnest face in that bar flashing in my mind. His words came back to me, a shield against her venomous sweetness. You're not a throwaway, Kaylin. You're the lifeblood. Mother, I said, my voice devoid of the anger I felt, replaced instead by a chilling, resolute calm. I will not use my company as a stepping stone for anyone. Aegis Command was built on competence, on performance, not on backroom deals and family connections. I paused, letting the words sink in. I'm sorry, but the answer is no. The line went silent for a moment. The syrupy sweetness vanished, replaced by ice. I see, she said, then a sharp, definitive click. The sound of the phone hanging up was louder and more final than any insult she could have hurled. The retaliation was swift and impersonal. A week later, a certified letter arrived at my garage. It was from the administrator of my father's corporate benefits plan. It was a formal, jargon-filled notice informing me that, as a non-dependent adult with my own source of income, my coverage under the Thorne family's health insurance plan had been terminated, effective immediately. It wasn't about the money. It was a message. It was a punishment for my disobedience, a clear and calculated move to remind me of my vulnerability, to show me that they still held power over my well-being. They were cutting the last practical tie that bound me to them. I stood there in the cold garage, the letter in my hand, and I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange, cold clarity. They had drawn their line in the sand. This wasn't a family squabble anymore. The war had just officially begun. For a few brilliant, deceptive months, it felt like we were winning. Aegis Command, with Jax now as my full partner, had landed a major contract with Stryker Dynamics, a name that carried the weight of a battleship in the defense industry. The victory was tangible. We hired our first employee, a young, hungry engineer named Finn. The cold garage in Baltimore began to feel less like a hideout and more like a real headquarters, buzzing with the low hum of servers and the energy of creation. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that I had finally outrun the long shadow of my family. That belief was a fragile glass structure, and it was shattered one Monday morning by a single email. The subject line, displayed in stark black letters, made my blood run cold. Notice of Unscheduled Comprehensive Security Audit. Aegis Command LLC. The sender was the Defense Logistics Agency, the DLA. My years in the military had taught me the difference between a routine checkup and an autopsy. This wasn't a friendly review. This was a full-scale, top-to-bottom, invasive deep dive audit. The kind designed not to ensure compliance, but to find a single, fatal flaw to justify termination. It was a declaration of war, delivered with the chilling impersonality of a government server. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up my throat. Breathe, assess, act. Jax, with his quiet, lethal efficiency and a network of contacts from his MARSOC days, made a few discreet calls. The intelligence came back within hours, whispered over a secure line, and it confirmed my worst fears. The audit had been strongly suggested during a casual conversation by a senior civilian official at the Pentagon, a man who, it turned out, was a regular fixture in my father's weekend golf foursome at the Army-Navy Country Club. They weren't just hoping I would fail. They were actively engineering it, leveraging decades of cultivated influence to punish me for my insubordination. The message was as clear as a gunshot. You will not succeed without our permission. The next few weeks descended into a frantic, sleepless blur. We were drowning in paperwork, responding to endless, ridiculously detailed requests for information that delved into every line of code I'd ever written. It was a war of attrition designed to bleed us dry of time and money. As we battled the DLA, a sick, gnawing suspicion began to grow in my gut. This felt too vicious, too desperate, even for my father. This wasn't just about control. It was about something else. On a hunch, I made a call to an old college acquaintance, Sarah, a sharp financial analyst on Wall Street. "I need a favor," I said. "Can you do some discreet digging, public records, credit reports, anything you can find on Alistair and Isolde Thorne?" The file she sent back 2 days later was the final devastating blow. The Thorne family, the proud, untouchable dynasty of Arlington, was a house of cards on the verge of collapse. They were drowning in debt. They had taken out a second mortgage on the historic Arlington house. My father had plowed their dwindling fortune into a series of high-risk hedge funds that had imploded. And then came the paragraph that made me physically sick: to secure a massive, last-ditch personal loan to maintain their lavish lifestyle. The European vacations, the charity galas, the political donations. My father had used his most valuable asset as leverage. Not property, not stocks. He had used the sterling reputation and projected career trajectory of his golden child, Major Genevieve Thorne, as a form of intangible collateral with private, high-risk lenders. They were sinking into a financial abyss of their own making, and in their desperation, they were trying to pull me under with them, to destroy the one success story that served as a glaring spotlight on their own catastrophic failure. The hypocrisy was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. That night, I sat alone in the silent, cavernous garage, the single bare bulb overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the concrete floor. The DLA audit could ruin everything I had poured my blood and soul into. My family's pride was so pathologically fragile that they would rather see me destroyed than have their perfect image tarnished by their own incompetence. I remembered a line from Admiral William H. McRaven's famous commencement speech, a video I had watched dozens of times during my darkest nights in Afghanistan. "If you want to change the world," he'd said, his voice steady and strong, "don't ever, ever ring the bell." Ringing the bell in SEAL training meant quitting. It meant you were broken. I stared at the massive whiteboard that covered one wall of the garage. It was a chaotic, beautiful tapestry of my mind, complex algorithms, server architecture diagrams, logistical flowcharts. This was my world. A world I had built from nothing with my own two hands, on a foundation of integrity and sheer stubborn persistence. I would not let them burn it to the ground. The simmering anger I had carried for years no longer felt like a quiet internal burn. It erupted not into a hot, screaming rage, but into a fire of ice-cold, crystalline fury. A profound, unshakable resolve settled over me, chilling and absolute. I would not just survive this, I would win. But I would no longer play by their rules. I would play by mine. My hands were steady as I picked up my phone and dialed Jax's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice laced with the same weary tension that had become our constant companion. "Any news on the audit?" he asked. "Forget the audit," I said, my voice quiet, but harder than steel. "I have a new strategy. It's time to stop playing defense." He was silent for a moment, processing the shift in my tone. "What are you thinking, Kaylin?" I looked at the whiteboard, at the empire I had built, and then I looked through it, at the empire I was about to conquer. "They're drowning in debt," I stated, the words tasting like ash and iron. "So we're going to become their creditors. We're buying their debt, Jax, all of it." The rage I felt that night didn't burn out. It condensed. It transformed from a hot, blinding fire into the cold, clear focus of a diamond. The question was no longer if I would fight back, but how. My entire military career had been about logistics, the unglamorous critical art of seeing the whole battlefield, of understanding that grand strategies are meaningless without a flawless supply chain. This was no different. I was no longer a victim reacting to attacks. I was a strategist planning a campaign. I remembered a principle from Sun Tzu's The Art of War, a book my father revered as a theoretical text, but never truly understood as a practical guide. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. I knew my enemy's weaknesses intimately. Now it was time to build my strength. Jax and I began to operate like a two-person special operations unit, our garage transforming from a startup office into a war room. He, with his easy confidence and network of loyal contacts, handled the external-facing tasks, the field work. I became the commander, the strategist, the intelligence officer, working from the glow of my multiple monitors. The first step was to construct a legal and financial fortress, a series of firewalls to mask our operations. On the advice of a shrewd, razor-sharp corporate lawyer in Wilmington, we began our silent invasion. The battlefield was the Delaware General Corporation law. We established a series of anonymous LLCs, each a ghost entity with a bland, unremarkable name designed to be utterly invisible. Sentinel Holdings LLC was our first deployment. Its sole mission, to discreetly approach the secondary lender holding the second mortgage on the Arlington house and purchase the debt at a discount. The bank, seeing a toxic asset, was only too happy to offload it. With a single wire transfer, I owned the roof over my family's head. Next came Vanguard Medical Partners LLC. My mother's stress-induced heart problems, a fact I'd gleaned from a public hospital gala announcement, were generating a steady stream of exorbitant medical bills. As they went unpaid, they were sold off to aggressive collection agencies. Vanguard was there to buy that debt, becoming the silent arbiter of her health care. And then there was my masterpiece of sublime, bitter irony, Keystone Strategic Solutions LLC. This entity was created to offer an anonymous, high-paying consulting contract directly to my father. He, whose ego would never allow him to believe he was unemployable, accepted the generous offer from the mysterious firm, oblivious to the fact that he was now my unwitting employee. I was paying his salary with the profits from the company he had tried to destroy. With my financial weapons in place, my role shifted. I became an intelligence analyst, my methods honed by years of military threat assessment. I followed their lives not as a distant daughter, but as a hunter tracking its prey. I monitored Genevieve's proud, oblivious social media posts from exclusive DC events. I read my father's arrogant op-eds on foreign policy in defense journals. I cross-referenced names from charity event programs with public records. Every piece of data was a tile in a mosaic of their staggering hypocrisy. I knew where they dined, which galas they attended, where they vacationed. I saw the nauseating contrast between their public image and their private reality. They posted smiling, carefully curated photos from a ski trip in Aspen, projecting an image of effortless wealth, while their Amex and Neiman Marcus credit card debts were being sold off in delinquent bundles for pennies on the dollar. And I, through my network of phantom LLCs, was always there to buy them. Every unpaid account, every desperate line of credit eventually found its way into my invisible financial empire. All the while, the DLA security audit raged on. It was their primary weapon, a constant, grinding pressure. But they had fundamentally underestimated me. They saw a supply clerk, not a Marine NCO who had built a system born from the unforgiving logic of the battlefield. Aegis Command wasn't just good, it was perfect. It was built with military-grade discipline and a paranoid level of security. Every line of code was documented, every protocol triple-checked, every firewall hardened against any conceivable intrusion. For 3 grueling weeks, we complied with every request, answered every question, and submitted thousands of pages of documentation. We were exhausted but flawless. The DLA auditors, career bureaucrats who expected to find a sloppy, corner-cutting startup, found a digital fortress instead. They couldn't find a single significant vulnerability, not one crack in the armor they could exploit. They were forced, reluctantly, to issue a positive report, clearing Aegis Command of any wrongdoing. It was my first major victory, a silent but resounding win that echoed through the small, insular world of defense contractors. I had faced their best shot, their full political power, and I had not buckled. I had proven my competence under fire, not on a foreign battlefield, but in the sterile, high-stakes war of federal contracting. That night, Jax, Finn, and I celebrated with cheap pizza and beer in the garage. But as they laughed and recounted the most ridiculous of the DLA's requests, a quiet, cold confidence settled over me. This was just one battle. The war was far from over. But now my supply lines were secure. My secret weapons were deployed. My invisible empire was built. I was ready for the final confrontation. The phone call came a week before Thanksgiving. It was my mother. Her voice, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, was coated in a thin veneer of warmth. It was a clumsy, unnatural sound, like a predator trying to mimic the call of its prey. "Kaylin, darling," she began, "Thanksgiving is almost here. Why don't you come home for dinner? We miss you." "We miss you." The lie was so blatant it was almost insulting. I knew this wasn't a genuine olive branch. I knew they'd heard about Aegis Command passing the DLA audit, a piece of news that would have traveled fast through the DC grapevine. They didn't miss me. They wanted something. Their first attack had failed. so now they were reverting to a different strategy: feigned affection. An old version of me would have felt a flicker of hope. But the woman who had spent the last several months building a financial siege engine felt nothing but the cold, clear recognition of an opportunity. They had just handed me the perfect stage. "I'd love to, Mom," I replied, my voice smooth and even. "I'll be there." I wouldn't be arriving as the prodigal daughter, the black sheep returning to the fold. I would arrive as a strategist entering the final negotiation, as an executioner walking toward the gallows. The Arlington house smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and simmering hypocrisy. The table was set with the family's finest silver and china, a perfect picture of holiday tradition. Genevieve was there, looking brilliant in a cashmere sweater, her conversation light and effortless. My father carved the turkey with practiced patriarchal authority, while my mother fussed over the cranberry sauce. The tension in the room was a palpable thing, a thick, cloying atmosphere of unspoken needs and false pleasantries. They waited until after the main course, after the wine had been poured, and the pretense of a happy family dinner had been sufficiently performed. My father cleared his throat, placing his fork and knife down with a delicate clink. He beamed at me across the table, a magnanimous, condescending smile. "Kaylin, your mother and I are so incredibly proud of what you've accomplished with your company," he began, the praise as hollow as a drum. "It's truly remarkable." He let the statement hang in the air, waiting for me to bask in it. I simply stared back, my expression unreadable. He continued, getting to the real point of the evening. "The thing is, the family has found itself in a bit of a tight spot financially. A temporary cash flow issue, you understand. With your recent success, we were hoping you might be in a position to help out a little." This was it, the moment I had been planning for. The air crackled with anticipation. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my own fork down on the pristine white tablecloth. The small sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence. I looked directly into my father's eyes, holding his gaze without flinching. "I know," I said, my voice quiet, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "I know everything." From the leather satchel at my feet, I withdrew a slim black document folder. I placed it on the table between the half-eaten pumpkin pie and the crystal water goblets. The soft thud of the folder hitting the wood was like a gavel striking down. My father's smile faltered. My mother's hand froze on its way to her wine glass. Genevieve just looked confused. I opened the folder. "You're right, Dad. The family is in a tight spot." I slid the first document across the table toward him. "This is the deed transfer for this house. The second mortgage was purchased 6 months ago from the bank by a company called Sentinel Holdings, LLC. My company. I own this house." His face, flushed with wine and self-importance, began to pale. I didn't give him time to respond. I turned to my mother, sliding another paper in her direction. "And your recent heart troubles must be very stressful. I know the medical bills were. Thankfully, a firm called Vanguard Medical Partners bought all of your outstanding debt from the collection agencies. Another one of my companies. I've been paying for your treatment." My mother's mouth opened slightly, a small, silent O of disbelief. Her carefully constructed composure began to crumble. Finally, I looked back at my father. I pushed the last document toward him. "And this is a copy of your most recent consulting contract, the one you signed with Keystone Strategic Solutions. A very generous contract, I might add." I let a small, cold smile touch my lips. "Also my company. the unexpected blessings that have kept this family afloat for the last 6 months. Every single dollar came from me. The silence that fell over the dining room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating void where a family used to be. My father's face had drained of all color, leaving it a pasty, grayish white. My mother stared at the papers, her hands trembling, her mind clearly unable to process the information. It was Genevieve, the golden child, the major, who finally broke the silence. Her voice was a stammering, incredulous whisper. "Kaylin, what are you saying?" I stood up from the table. My movement was slow, measured, powerful. I was no longer the girl cowering in the corner. I was the one in command. My voice, when I spoke, was as cold and clear as a funeral bell. "I didn't come here to collect a debt," I said, my gaze sweeping over their shattered faces. "I came here to deliver a truth. You taught me that legacy is everything, Dad. That bloodline is all that matters. But you were wrong. Competence is everything. Performance is everything." I took a step back from the table, my hands resting on the back of my chair. "You called me a throwaway." The words hung in the air, stripped of their power to hurt me, now repurposed as a weapon. But now this throwaway is deciding whether all of you still have a roof over your heads tomorrow. I left the Arlington house that Thanksgiving night without another word. The silence of their shattered world deafening at my back. The drive back to Baltimore felt different. The weight that had settled in my bones for 31 years had lifted. But in its place wasn't elation. It was a vast, hollow emptiness, the aftershock. The days that followed were a storm of reactions. My father retreated into a stony, defeated silence, the silence of a king who had been deposed in his own court. My mother, on the other hand, waged a campaign of emotional warfare. There were tearful, pleading voicemails left at all hours, begging me to reconsider, to not do this to them. Then came the barrage of furious text messages from Genevieve, a torrent of digital venom calling me a traitor, a cold, calculating monster who had destroyed her own family for sport. I didn't answer a single call or reply to a single text. The emotional battlefield they had always controlled was now closed for business. Instead, I had my lawyer draft a formal, unemotional email. It clearly stipulated the new terms of our relationship. They could continue to reside in the Arlington house, provided all non-essential spending ceased. My father's consulting contract with Keystone was terminated, effective immediately. My financial support would be limited to covering the basic mortgage payments and my mother's essential medical needs. The email ended with a clear, concise sentence. Further communication regarding these matters should be directed to my legal counsel. I wasn't their bank. I was merely the entity keeping their ship from sinking completely. A week later, I drove with Jax down to Virginia Beach. I had made a decision. Aegis Command was moving. We needed a new headquarters, a place with salt in the air and a wide-open horizon, far from the suffocating power corridors of Washington, D.C. It was a symbolic and necessary move, a final severing of geographic ties. We sat on the sand, watching the gray Atlantic waves roll in and recede. The salty wind felt clean, like it was scouring the last remnants of the thorn toxicity from my soul. "How are you feeling?" Jax asked quietly. His gaze fixed on the horizon. I hugged my knees to my chest and answered with the most honest words I could find. "Empty," I said, my voice barely a whisper above the sound of the surf. "I won, but it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like an amputation, like cutting off a gangrenous limb. It's painful, but it was necessary to survive." Jax nodded slowly, understanding without needing more explanation. "That is the victory, Kaylin," he said. "The victory wasn't the moment they fell apart. It was the moment you realized you could live without their approval." His words resonated with something I had been reading, the works of Brené Brown on vulnerability and courage. She wrote about the courage to set boundaries and the pain that often comes with it. This was my rumble with vulnerability, and it was the hardest thing I had ever done. My final test came a few days later. My mother drove all the way to Baltimore and appeared, unannounced, at the door of my garage. She looked smaller, lost, stripped of her Arlington authority and social armor. She stood awkwardly on the oil-stained concrete, a ghost from a past life. "Can't we start over, Kaylin?" she pleaded, her eyes filled with a desperation I had never seen before. "As a family." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the familiar sting of anger or the dull ache of resentment. I just felt a profound, bottomless sadness for what we never were and could never be. "No, Mom," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "That ship sailed a long time ago. I will always make sure you have what you need to be safe and healthy. I promise you that." I took a small step back, creating a physical and emotional border between us. "But the family you want, that's gone." I pulled the heavy garage door down, the rattling chain a sound of finality. I hadn't closed it with anger. I had closed it with acceptance. The war was over. The borders were drawn. And on the other side of that line, for the first time, was my own undisputed territory. Our new headquarters in Virginia Beach thrived. Aegis Command grew into a leading name in secure logistics, respected for its efficiency and the impenetrable security I had built into its very DNA. We landed contracts that would have been unimaginable back in my cold Baltimore garage. But as the company flourished, I felt a familiar hollowness begin to creep back in. I soon realized that my greatest achievement wasn't going to be measured in the cold, hard numbers of a balance sheet or the prestige of a new government contract. My true legacy had to be something more, something that would fill the void that victory alone could not. That's why I started the Valkyrie Initiative. It's a nonprofit foundation funded by a dedicated percentage of Aegis's profits. Our mission is to provide seed capital, strategic mentorship, and a network of support to female veterans wanting to start their own businesses. I wanted to build the lifeline that I never had, to be the person who saw potential where others saw risk. In Norse mythology, the Valkyries chose who would live and who would die in battle. My Valkyries, I decided, would help women choose how to live fully and powerfully after their service was done. Our office isn't a gleaming glass tower designed to intimidate. It's a warm, open-plan co-working space a few blocks from the beach, filled with comfortable chairs, endless coffee, and the vibrant energy of collaboration. It's a place where tough, brilliant women can share ideas, celebrate wins, and most importantly, support each other through failures without judgment. I found a deeper, more resonant joy in seeing their businesses take flight than I ever did in my own. I wasn't just building a company anymore. I was building a community. My life, once defined by the echoing silence of a sterile house in Arlington, was now filled with the rich, joyful noise of a family I had chosen for myself. There was Jax, my partner in business and in life, the quiet, steady bedrock of my new world. There was Finn, our brilliant first hire, whose youthful enthusiasm felt more like that of a younger brother than an employee. There was the ever-growing circle of women from the Valkyrie Initiative, a fierce and loyal sisterhood forged in shared ambition and mutual respect. And there was Liam, a kind-eyed naval architect I met while walking my dog on the beach, a man who saw all my scars and loved me for them, not in spite of them. He loved me for the person I was, not for the company I owned or the connections I had. Our weekend dinners were a world away from the tense, strategic affairs of my past. We'd gather on my back deck, the air thick with the smell of Old Bay seasoning from a massive pot of Maryland-style steamed crabs spread over a newspaper-covered table. There were no discussions of power or policy, only the messy, wonderful chaos of shared stories and easy, unbridled laughter, set to the soundtrack of clinking beer bottles and the rhythmic crash of the nearby waves. This was my new legacy. It was loud, imperfect, and beautiful. One evening, I was standing on my balcony, watching the last sliver of the sun dip below the Atlantic horizon, painting the sky in serene shades of orange and purple. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. It was a number I hadn't dialed or answered in over a year. Alistair Thorne. A ghost of the old tension flickered inside me, a reflexive tightening in my chest. But it was just a flicker, a muscle memory, not a fire. I took a breath of the salty air and answered the call. For a long moment, there was only the sound of his unsteady, shallow breathing on the other end of the line. Then his voice came, not booming or authoritative, but thin, frail, and trembling with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Kaylin," he started, his voice cracking. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I stood there, my hand resting on the balcony rail, listening to the gentle sea breeze rustle the leaves of the palm trees. The words I once would have given anything to hear, the words I had craved for decades, now landed without impact. They were just sounds, empty of the power they once held to either wound or heal me. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel the sting of anger. I just felt quiet, a profound and settled peace. "I heard you," I said softly, and then I gently ended the call. In that moment, I knew I had forgiven them. Not because they deserved it, or because his apology had changed anything. I had forgiven them because I deserved to be free. The real victory wasn't the moment they admitted they were wrong. The real victory was the moment their words, their approval, their very existence no longer had the power to define my worth. Standing there with the vast, peaceful ocean before me and the sounds of my real family laughing inside, I knew I had finally made it home. I was free.